Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode.
Well, hello, and thank you for joining us. Today we have our guest, Dr. Michael Haykin, the chair and professor of church history at Southern Theological Seminary, and he's also the director of the Andrew Fuller Center for Baptist Studies at Southern, and he's also a distinguished faculty of Heritage Theological and Seminary, where both Luke and I went. And so he has had his mark on our lives, not just as a historian and introducing us to theological writers, but he has also, in a very personal way, really opened up a world of spirituality to me that entering into that school, I can't say that I had. And so we are very excited to talk to him today about our world and society and how our faith in Jesus can make us effective witnesses in this world. So thank you for joining us, Michael.
It's great. Great to be with you.
Yeah, right on. Maybe just to dive into, to give some of our listeners a window into who you are, what kind of drives your current work and your passions for that. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, your background, maybe what you're working on, especially in this unique season of COVID, and some of the passions that really drive you as a scholar?
Yes, so I was born in England and grew up in an Irish Catholic home. My mother was Irish Catholic. My father was not a Catholic. He was actually a Muslim, born in Kurdistan in northern Iraq, and came to study in England in the late 40s, met my mom and married. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, wouldn't allow them to marry if my dad didn't become Catholic. So he became Catholic. So I was really raised in a very Catholic home, typically Irish Catholic. We moved to Canada. My father got a teaching position in electrical engineering in the 1960s, mid-60s, at McMaster University. So we moved to Canada. It was very disorienting for me. I've always loved history, and I perceived myself, I was around 12 when we moved. I perceived myself as kind of moving into this ahistorical void. According to my father, I remember mentioning to him when I was told that we were going to go to Canada, that I told him that we could sum up Canadian history in an hour or so. And it was really kind of boring. You have to, appreciate that I grew up on my way to school. I passed the ruins of a 14th or 15th century tower that had been once part of a castle.
Yeah.
We lived near Warwick Castle, which is kind of one of the great castles of the medieval world in England, and on and on and on.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, and then having to leave all my friends in England, 12 years old is a difficult age because you're moving out of childhood into adulthood. And so that compounded with the move, my sense of Canada being a void, the food, the climate. It was much colder than I ever expected. The first winter, I got frostbite on my ears because I didn't wear a hat. And my father also innocently took me up to the high school, and I was 12. So this is grade 9.
Ooh.
January of grade 9. I had just turned 12. And he told them, I'd started Latin and French, which I had. England, you go to high school or grammar school or comprehensive school, whatever it's called, at the age of 11. And so my father thought high school was the same. And they put me into grade 9. And in those days, a lot of students would, they'd keep them back if they failed. They don't do that now, I don't think. So I was in a class with guys in their, 15, 60, some of them. I mean, it wasn't the most brilliant class. To be honest, I mean, some of these guys turned out to be mobsters later. I mean, real mobsters.
Wow.
Was a member of, I'm not sure if it was Hell's Angels, got blown up trying to bomb another gang.
Wow.
And these guys were just thugs already. So I'm in this class, and it's completely disorienting. I'm going home to play with G.I. Joe. They're going out with girls and drinking. And all that to say this is I found my move to Canada completely disorienting. Yeah. And my father was having to spend a lot of his time at work. I really didn't sense him as a guiding force. In my teens, I was very close to my mom, but I ended up getting involved in just the radical left. It's the late 60s, early 70s, a kind of turmoil similar to what we've experienced this summer. Riots, radical elements in society. So by the time I was 14, I was a committed Marxist. Wanted to burn down the Canadian society, looked for a revolution. My heroes were people like Che Guevara, the Black Panthers, a group called the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, particularly the radical wing of that, the Weathermen, who basically were involved in trying to sabotage government institutions in the United States.
Wow.
And so I rejected Christianity. I'm not sure I ever became an atheist, but I certainly didn't have much time for God. So when I went to university in Western Ontario, I was 17 in year one. And again, I went through a period of disorientation. I had built a close number of friends during my high school years, but here I was by myself. And I had one friend, and he had become a Christian through the witness of some Jesus people. And he shared the gospel with me, but it didn't make an impact. But I did begin to realize that Marxism had nothing to say about life after death. And so I began, like many of my generation, to get involved in spirituality and Eastern spirituality, things like Zen Buddhism. But my interest in spirituality in some ways dates from that period. And in God's providence, I was working one summer in 1973 at a pizza parlor in Hamilton, Ontario, Westdale, and it was known as Mother's Pizza. They eventually went on to have a chain of about 70 stores across Canada, and but it collapsed somewhere in probably the early part of this millennium. And there was a young woman working there named Allison, who I was initially attracted to because of her red hair. I've always loved red hair. My mom had red hair, and I got. I
don't know if you can tell in the video, but I have red hair, so I appreciate the vote of confidence.
Oh, I love red hair. My wife and I were hoping for kids with red hair, but they both ended up with brown hair. And but anyway, so she was a Christian. She was a Baptist. Went to Stanley Avenue Baptist Church, and I was thinking like a Catholic, and I asked her if I could go to church with her to clean up my life, because my life was a bit of a mess. And she said yes, and it was there that I heard the gospel. Stanley Avenue is a Fellowship Baptist Church. I was converted there in the spring of '74. Wow. At least that's the time period. I think my actual conversion probably came earlier in some ways, but it was in '74, February of '74, that I actually made a decision. And sensed a call to vocational ministry, and went to Wycliffe College that fall. Stayed on to get a PhD. I didn't. I got my MDiv and then my PhD, and started teaching at Central Baptist Seminary in the fall of 1982. Central became a part of London Baptist Bible College and Seminary. So that's something of my background. My early Christian experience was very much in the charismatic movement. Wow. The pastor at the time was kind of one of the black sheep of the fellowship. He was really open. He was open to the charismatic movement in a way that many Fellowship Baptist pastors were not. And so that had an influence on me. And so for about 4 or 5 years, I would have identified myself as a charismatic Baptist. Baptistic in terms of ecclesiology, but open to the kind of charismata that the charismatic movement emphasized. That gave me a long-lasting interest in the work of the Spirit and spirituality, which really in some ways goes back to my late teens, but was established by that experience. I mean, I'm not what you would describe today in one sense as a charismatic. I have problems with a lot of its theology, but it did give me an interest in the Spirit. And I did my doctoral work in that area. And that has been a major theme in my life ever since. So.
Wow.
Now,
pneumatology for the win.
Now, when you mentioned sort of in those early years in your young adulthood, and you were sort of self-identifying under, Marx, Trotsky, these individuals who desired social reform, and you were really saying like you understood that it would require burning down Canada. What was sort of the ideological underpinnings of what it meant to transform a culture under that banner in your mind in that day?
Well, Marxism, at least at that point, what we have today in a lot of the turmoil is a cultural version of classical Marxism. But classical Marxism is it's an economic analysis, and the argument is that the dominant political force over the last couple hundred years in Western culture has been the bourgeoisie, the middle class. And there is a inbuilt tension between the middle class and the working class. And so the various class structures always try to hold on to power. And so for there to be a realization of genuine democracy where all people have an opportunity to advance according to their skills, and there is an equal opportunity for all individuals, you basically have to break the power of the middle class. And that, from a classical Marxist point of view, that's not going to happen without force. And so the idea of a violent revolution is necessary, and which inevitably means the killing of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and so on. In other words, it really is quite violent in terms of one's thinking. The idea of a Marxist realization of their dreams to do that peacefully is you look at the 20th century, and what you see is a wasteland that follows after Marxists get control of a society. There's the only exception to that might be Allende in Chile in the 70s, but basically, you think about Stalin in Russia, Mao Zedong in China, the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, Cuba, on and on and on.
And for you personally, what did that mean for you as an individual as you looked around the world that you saw growing up?
Well, I think as I look back now, I think I was angry. I was just a very angry person. I was angry at my father for bringing me to Canada. I was angry for not fitting in to some degree. In grade 9, I had an English accent, which I tried to eliminate, and so I was called Limey. And then in grade 10, there was a couple of students who, because my name was still, my birth name was Azad Anthony Michael Hakim. So we didn't anglicize that until about 71. So I was, I had this Muslim name, and so I was called Arab, which, if you know anything about the Kurdish Arab situation in Iraq, I mean, the Kurds can't stand the Arabs and vice versa. So that was and then one student actually called me the N-word all year, all grade 10. And so I experienced really kind of a lot of racism.
Yeah.
And so I was angry. And I think the kind of radical Marxism is attractive because you feel a sense of empowerment, you know, you just wait, you're kind of telling others you'll get yours. And so I think that was what was attractive to me, was that this was a funnel or a channel for my anger.
Yeah. Wow. And so I appreciate, you giving us a snapshot a minute ago of talking about, that the exposure to the gospel. I think you said in early 1974, maybe late 73. And that really changing the trajectory of your life, you pursuing, studies at Wycliffe, as you noted. And just ask maybe if you could give us one or two things on even just a personal heart change level. You're at this place of feeling a real, like you said, anger. And that does a 180. What makes up that 180 in your own life and your own heart?
Well, part of it was starting to develop a love for my father, and realizing the sacrifices he has made for me and my sister, and my mother. I didn't like my father when I was in my teens, and my conversion, it didn't happen overnight, but my conversion changed that and provided a foundation for definitely very different affections towards my father. And then another this is a very little thing. So, I mean, part of being, the world in which I inhabited in high school was very cliquish. I went to Ancaster High and Vocational School, which is a very cliquish school. You wouldn't necessarily know that living in Barrie, but it's Ancaster is a very wealthy suburb of Hamilton. A lot of my friends would spend their winters down at Ellicottville skiing. Their parents had cottages, etc. So it's a very wealthy environment, and so there's a hunger among many of the teens to want to be in the in crowd. And some of the most things that cause shame to me now, even now, 45 years later, are experiences where we purposely excluded people because they weren't cool. All that changed when I became a Christian, and the way the little incident that kind of illustrates that. In my second year of my seminary, there was a young man who was part of my class named Warren. And my initial take on Warren was he wasn't fully evangelical, and I really didn't like him. And every fall, there was a major book sale on the U of T campus. Wycliffe College is part of the University of Toronto. And the book sale was at Trinity College, which is one of the major colleges. Wycliffe is a much smaller college. And they're right across the road from Wycliffe. And this particular year, I don't think I made it to the book sale, which is very unusual because I love book sales. And Warren did go, and the books are fabulously priced. You can get all kinds of stuff for $1 or, $2, whatever. And Warren came to me, the week following the sale in October and said, I went to the book sale at Trinity, or Trins, as we used to call it, across the road. And I said, oh, yeah, that's interesting. I really didn't spend a lot of time in conversation with him. And he said, I bought you a book. And I still have the book. He gave it to me, and he knew that I was very interested in the early church. And it was a copy of the Greek edition, the Greek text of Athanasius' On the Incarnation of the Word. And it only cost him $1. But I never forgot that. He must have known that I basically tolerated him. I had an instinctive dislike of him. I couldn't be what I was like when I was a pagan. You kind of had to go through the motions of liking him. But I suddenly realized that just melted me. And I've never forgotten that as an example of the love that needs to characterize us as believers.
Yeah.
So this sort of thing, these are the sort of changes that started coming into my life. A lot of the anger was diffused. But to be honest, it was probably not till my late 40s, maybe early 50s, that the rebelliousness was gone. And so even sometimes as a faculty member, I remember disagreements I got into. This was at Heritage, a disagreement with the president over the issue of the allowing students or not allowing students to imbibe alcohol Faculty didn't have to sign a disclosure statement that they wouldn't imbibe, but students did. I remember raising this. And if you'd asked me why I raised it, well, I raised it because in my mind at the time, it was a freedom issue, a freedom of conscience. But the reality was, looking back now, there was still a bit of that old rebel there. And it takes a long time sometimes for these patterns. A lot of the men and women of my generation were rebels. And it takes a long time for that kind of stuff to get worked out of you. And so, yeah, there's been a number of radical changes in my life.
Now, when you talk about this transformation, this really radical transformation from anger to love of neighbor, even a person like Warren who drives you up the wall to love that person, as you talk about this rebellious spirit and God giving you a new spirit, is there anything in that sort of old ideology of what many today would think of as just cultural Marxism? Is there anything in that you see as being redeemable, or is it sort of diametrically opposed to Christianity?
Yeah, so what's happened in the last 25 years, and it was already happening in the 60s, is that Marxism, classical Marxism is an economic theory. When it hits the 20th century, Lenin reinterprets it because, according to Marx, the first culture that would experience the revolution would be the most industrially advanced culture, which in his day would have been Germany or Britain. And the revolution didn't happen there. It happened in Russia, which is the most industrial and socially backward of all the nations in Europe. And so Lenin has to reinterpret this. And he reinterprets it along the lines of there is this web of capitalist societies, and Russia is the weak link. And that's where it's going to start, and it's going to then cascade into the other cultures. So over the years, there's been these reinterpretations of Marxism. And in the 1960s, there is a very influential figure who I read fairly heavily, Herbert Marcuse, Marcuse. He was a German emigrate to the United States, part of what's called the Frankfurt School. And he interprets Marxism along the lines of cultural oppression. So it's not simply the middle class or economically oppressing the working class, but we're also culturally oppressing them. And so this is really being picked up in the 90s and the present day. So what you have today is this model of, so you've got, instead of simply economic oppression down through the centuries, you now have cultural oppression, and the leading cultural oppressors are white, straight men. Men in terms of oppressing women, straight because they're oppressing gays and lesbians and transgender, and then they're white. So to be a white straight male, you automatically got privilege and power, which actually doesn't run true. I mean, you go to various parts of North America, some of the worst communities in terms of social advance are poor white communities in the Appalachians, for example. Anyway, this is the way the theory goes. And so that's become a very dominant part of kind of the rhetoric in the last 20 years. Does it have any redeemable qualities? Well, yes, to some degree. I mean, it's not without a certain degree of truth. There are ways in which there have been a patronizing of women. And the generation before me, you'd hear these jokes made by senior pastors who are maybe 15, 20 years older than me about women. And I now remember them, and they always disturb me. And so there is some of that. It's been a very prominent part of our culture. I mean, women didn't get the vote in Canada until, the 20th century, less than 100 years ago. And there are, of course, there's been racism down through the years. The Irish, I mean, growing up as a Catholic with a Muslim name in England was no fun.
Wow.
Especially being an Irish culture.
Yeah.
The Irish have a saying, you don't need to tell me about what it means to be an African American. We were the African Americans of Great Britain. I mean, the British, the English have been very prejudiced against the Irish,
Hmm.
but it's not only the Irish, but the Jews. I mean, golf and country clubs in the early 20th century, it was difficult to get, if you were Jewish, to get a place in some of them. And then obviously our indigenous people, because we haven't had a large African element in our culture, maybe except for maybe the Maritimes, Nova Scotia. So there is some degree of truth in all this.
Yeah.
And but the answers that, you know, I think Black Lives Matter are trying to bring forward will be deeply destructive of many of the structures of our culture. They're destructive of the typical family model, the traditional family model, which is based on scripture, you know, husband and wife, etc. And it strikes me that to divide, to actually say that white men are inherently racist and the rest of us aren't, or the rest of people aren't. I mean, there's no way that a large segment of Canadian society or North American society, white straight males, can ever do anything to redeem themselves. You're just inherently, basically you're done.
Yeah.
So in other words, I think the analysis is not incorrect completely,
Right.
but they have no solution.
Yeah.
It makes me think of the line that Solzhenitsyn said about the line between good and evil running through the heart of every human being, and how easy it is to want to caricature, one body in the populace is inherently evil, and then to cut that off and say, well, now we'll be okay with them, removed from us. So powerful insights. I wonder, Dr. Haykin, just on maybe looking especially at the church in the West, we often hear the phrase culture wars coming up in Christian circles. And this tension, even now, almost every day in the news, there's a Christian popping up who sees wearing a mask as a specific breach of their rights, or the sign of the beast, or something like that. And maybe that's an extreme example one direction. But when you think about the church and you think about its role in culture and in the world at large, do you think there's a better way we can think about the church and especially the kingdom of God than just saying, well, we're at war with culture? What's your take on the way the church should be present to culture?
Well, I mean, historically, if you look at the history of the church, you've got a number of patterns or models, whether or not they've ever been carried out exactly, of which one model is church against culture. And it's inevitable. I mean, Jesus' statement, if they hate me, they will hate you. So inevitably, there are going to be patterns of cultural development that are antithetical to the gospel, in which we find ourselves against culture. But I don't think it's a completely healthy model to always be thinking, that the culture's out to get us, and that the Antichrist is lurking behind all of the legislation that's coming down the pike. In other words, I think we have to think along other lines. I mean, sometimes the church has affirmed the church over culture. In other words, the church needs to be the dominant power in society, as it was in the medieval period. I've got problems with that personally as a Baptist. I think it's noteworthy at times, say the 18th century, the church was a balm for culture. They were at the forefront of certain social movements. For instance, the whole abolition of slavery. That would not have taken place in the British Empire without the church. It was the church that pushed it. The whole area of cruelty to animals. It's Christians who found the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and raised a consciousness that animals aren't simply tools to be used unthinkingly. They're sentient beings. They may not have reason the way we do, but they're sentient beings that need to be respected as part of God's creation.
Yeah.
So I think the church was at the forefront of that. I mean, but the problem I think that has happened in the last 100 years is we've inherited a model, because a lot of the kind of social justice kind of push in certain Christian circles in the late 19th century led to what we call the social gospel and the downplaying of the death of Christ, the miracles, the inspiration of Scripture, and so on, that there was a parting of the ways somewhere between the 1890s and 1920s between what became evangelical Christianity and what is kind of liberal theology. And so we've been burdened by this division, so that as soon as you start to talk about, being environmentally aware, thinking about what we're doing to the environment, thinking about how we're impacting animals, raising questions about, patriarchy and the way we treat women, raising questions about race, you're suddenly labeled. But the church should be at the forefront of these things. Instead, as you said, we're fighting about masks.
Yeah.
And it's got to do with our freedoms and our rights. And the perception, I think, that, if the government is mandating these various things regarding the church, they're out to destroy the church. And we're being persecuted. And I've even heard people talking about the governments of Canada and the government of Ontario as tyrannical. Well, okay. I mean, the problem with that sort of argument is that it really undermines what you mean by the word tyrant or tyrannical or persecution. I mean, then what do you do with them with North Korea or China? And what are they going through? If we're going through persecution by tyrants, what are they going through? And it strikes me that there isn't a lot of similarity. So I think I'm concerned that in the middle of the context in which we're in, we're arguing about whether or not we can wear masks, whereas earlier generations of Christians would have been in the forefront of the caring for the sick and
now,
trying to help.
Could you give us a couple examples from, as a patristic scholar, some early church examples of Christians who were just at the forefront of social change, and maybe how they were able to implement lasting change, or at least be a voice for those who were suffering in their day?
Probably the classic example that comes to mind is what's known as the Plague of Cyprion, because Cyprian, the Christian bishop in Carthage, it gives probably the longest description of what took place. But somewhere in the 250s, probably something similar to COVID hit the Roman Empire. Its origins was probably Ethiopia, and it ravaged the empire for 20 years. 2 emperors died of it.
Wow.
We have stories in Alexandria. Dionysius of Alexandria tells us that because now you need to recognize there are no hospitals, so there's nowhere to take the sick, and so the pagans are scuttling out of the city as fast as they can go, leaving behind friends, relatives, you name it. And the Christians are the ones who ended up standing in the breach, taking care of these people, and as a result, dying of the plague. And the early church then would regard these men and women as martyrs. Whether or not that's an appropriate designation for them is another question. But here you have an example. And this radically changed the way in which Christianity was perceived. People had heard about Christianity. They assumed it was an atheistic underground movement where people actually engaged in acts of cannibalism and incest. Complete misunderstandings of various aspects of Christianity. Well, one of the reasons that some scholars now give for the rapid advance of the gospel in particularly the Eastern Roman Empire in the last probably quarter of the 3rd century is because of the respect that Christianity garnered when this plague had hit. And I think that stands in complete contrast to some of the stuff that's going on today, where I think the way in which we're going about some of the stuff is actually reinforcing in the minds of pagans that Christians are complete wingnuts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's one example. The other, I think, would be the whole issue of slavery in the 18th century, which I mentioned earlier. The way in which Christians refuse to engage in activities that involve the slave trade. So William Carey, in 1792, when he drew up a plan for missions, which was almost unheard of in the English-speaking world at the time, when the question of where are we going to get money to send missionaries, he said, why don't we give up using sugar? Because sugar was a product of Jamaica and Barbados and the Bahamas, where the British had employed armies of African slaves enslaved to produce sugar crop. And so Carey says, let's give up West India sugar, which he said, you don't need me to remind you, but it was being, you're using it on the basis of blood, the blood of these men and women who labored in these fields as slaves to give you your sweet sugar. And it would appear that significant numbers of men and women did that very thing. And so there was the long-term impact of was the abolition of the slave trade, 1807, and then the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833.
And I think, we could probably insert in there the Clapham sect with Wilberforce and others who right around the same time in the 1790s were, I think if it's fair to say, also starting to take efforts to abolish slavery. Would that be fair as well? Like,
yeah. I mean, they're the major political force. Baptists like Carey don't have the political clout that those men did, but they did provide them with the foundation by which they could basically present petitions to Parliament, to show that there was a significant uprising of moral disgust at slavery and the slave trade.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, you may have to correct me if I'm wrong. Please do. But I remember taking an introduction to the Greek fathers with you while I was at seminary. And I recall a small book written, I think, by Gregory of Nyssa on St. Macrina. And in there, I remember just finding it so surprising that she encouraged her mother to treat the maids as though they are sisters. And then I recall, I think it was a commentary on Ecclesiastes, where Gregory of Nyssa may have written about the true evil of owning another person. Am I right in saying that?
No, you're perfectly right. Yeah, fabulous. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Gregory Nyssa is quite an extraordinary figure because unlike some of the other Greek and Roman and Latin-speaking fathers, he does tackle slavery head on, and he comes from privilege, Cappadocian aristocracy, and his family owned homes in 3 provinces. So he knows what it is to have money and wealth and privilege, and his sister leads his family and her mother, their mother, into giving up some of that wealth, significant portion of it, basically freeing the slaves within their household and basically sitting down to eat with them on an equal level. And it does prompt in Gregory this eventual attack on slavery as an institution. Now, Greco-Roman slavery is a bit different from the slavery that the Europeans have experienced in the last 400 years. The European experience of slavery is deeply rooted in racism, because there is a kind of an urban myth going around out there that the British enslaved some of the Irish and took them over. They did try to convince some of the Irish to go and settle in the Bahamas. Because of their very fair skin, they basically burned up like crisps. But I mean, the British experience of the slave trade was only Africans they were enslaving, essentially. Maybe some indigenous people, but essentially Africans.
Mm.
And so it's a very different type of slavery. It's and also in the Greco-Roman world, a slave could get their freedom. They could end up becoming a very influential figure in society, which some did.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
began slave and ended up as Roman governors.
Yeah.
That was not happening in either the British Empire or the American world in the 19th, 18th, and so on centuries.
Yeah, yeah. No, understandably. So, Dr. Haykin, as a church historian, are you optimistic about our current cultural moment, both within the church and in the world? What's your take on that?
Yeah, one of the problems about providing an overview of our current day when you're in the middle of it is like being in the middle of a forest and trying to what's the forest look like? How wide is it? How deep is it? Its extent, etc. Because you can't see the forest for the trees. So when you're in the middle of a historical moment, it's very difficult to know how's this going to turn out. It's very easy to, in one sense, to look at the 19th century and say, well, this is the way things played out. This is probably the reason why, because you're able to consult a variety of factors. And when you're in the middle of a cultural moment, it's difficult to understand what's happening. I think overall, I think a Christian has to be optimistic. So my eschatology is a shaper here. I'm not a classical dispensationalist, and I think dispensationalism tends to be somewhat pessimistic. Everything's getting worse and worse and worse, and then Jesus is going to come along, rapture the church, and because we couldn't do it, and we're out of here. I'm amillennial in my eschatology, and I'm an optimistic amillennialist, and I have hope for the future. Not that the dispensationalist doesn't, but I have hope in history. It is amazing what has happened in, say, China. In 1949, when the missionaries were kicked out, there were 700,000 Christians. There might be somewhere around 30 million now.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's with a communist dictatorship. In Iran, since the Khomeini has taken over Iran and you've had this Muslim theocracy, I mean, the gospel is going gangbusters in Tehran. There are a number of underground churches that are just filled with people regularly, week after week. At least they were before COVID. So I'm optimistic. I mean, you think about the last 200 years. 200 years ago when, Kerry was still in India and they were engaged in, supporting and trying to promote missions around the world. Evangelical Christianity was pretty well limited to Europe and North America and the kind of the Atlantic seaboard of North America. Well, now look at it. I mean, Latin America, places like Brazil, the Reformed evangelicalism in Brazil is huge. South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, places like Zambia, 25% evangelical. China, I mean, there are some exceptions, 0.5% evangelical, or even Christian in Japan. Japan has proven very resistant to the gospel. But overall, Christianity might be dying and in real problems in Europe, and we're following hard after them in North America. But the rest, I mean, the church is clearly going to be rooted and grounded in what we call the majority world, or used to be called the third world. And that's encouraging. That's tremendously encouraging. So the most important event that's taken place in church history in the last 1,000 years has been the modern missionary movement and its beginnings in the 1790s with people like William Carey. It's not the growth of liberalism in the West, which has decimated our churches. You think of Ontario with, the United Church. In 1925, 65% of evangelicals were in the United Church in Ontario.
Wow.
And today, the United Church has basically committed apostasy and it's devastated the cause of the gospel in Ontario. But God's still building his church, and it may not be here in Ontario, although we see encouraging signs. But so I think broadly speaking, I'm deeply optimistic. For the West, it's I think a very challenging time. I think if our universities start to buy into some of the ideology that's rampant in the current cultural moment, I think it's going to be devastating for education. So Rutgers University English department last week announced that English grammar by its very nature is inherently racist. So that they're planning not to teach English grammar and to allow people to express themselves in a variety of ways. It's a fascinating statement because in making it, they basically implied that non-English speaking people are not bright enough to understand English grammar. So here's the statement that claims that English grammar is racist, but in doing so, it's an inherently racist statement itself about non-English speaking people. But if that's the way our universities are going, it really is a sad day for university. And places like Heritage or Redeemer in Ontario become the bright spots educationally. And so I do expect that probably in going forward in the next 50 years, that a lot of what's going on in university will be cultural indoctrination, and that places where you actually are taught to how to think are going to be Bible colleges, Christian liberal arts schools.
Wow.
So am I optimistic? Yes, long term, big picture, but I'm somewhat pessimistic about what's going on in our culture currently.
Now, for those who are listening to this podcast who are maybe 16, they're thinking about university, and then we have those who are young adults into their 20s. What do you think ought to be the social responsibility of a Christian? And if we are truly able to be optimistic about our cultural moment, even with all of these challenges that you've expressed, how do you think that a Christian, can work for a significant, lasting social change in our day?
Well, I think one thing is we have to get over the divide between the gospel and social justice. We have to recognize the gospel has social impact and implications. We have to get beyond the fundamentalist, modernist debate of the early 20th century, which is still plaguing us, and go back to 18th and early 19th century forebears for whom gospel proclamation was central, but they recognized that if the gospel is proclaimed, it's going to have an inherent impact upon social structure. Secondly, I think we have to be prepared for the fact that universities may not be able to deliver on what they historically have been set up to. And I think churches need to support places like Redeemer, and Bible colleges like Heritage. They need to recognize that these places may well become the preeminent places of education for their young people. It raises all kinds of questions about the public schools system in Ontario, especially issues of our culture trying to impose sexual agendas in primary school. I've always been chary or wary of encouraging Christians to abandon the public school system, but it strikes me if I was a parent with young children, I think it would be difficult in some cases to recommend. Again, places are going to differ. Toronto is going to differ from, say, Harriston or Owen Sound or Listowel or Barrie. Or Aurelia, they're going to be different contexts, and I think we need to be prepared to recognize that maybe the public school in Harriston or Listowel is a bit different from what it's going to be like downtown Toronto. But I do think the church needs to think through the whole issue of education, both in terms of primary and secondary, but also at the university level. And places like Redeemer need to be supported. Because I see them as great options going forward. So, I mean, there's those sorts of things. I think we need to encourage more Christians to go into disciplines like law. Because I think for many pastors, I think they have very little understanding how the law works. And so what happens when certain laws are passed, which are violations of our understanding of how we should live? How do we engage with those? We need Christian lawyers. We should be encouraging Christians to go into politics. Thank God for John Newton. When William Wilberforce was converted in the 1780s, he went to John Newton and told him, I think I should leave politics. Just a dirty, messy business. And if he had gone to John Wesley would have told him, yeah, get out. Yeah. Wesley didn't have much use for politics, even though he did a lot of politicking. But John Newton wisely said, it seems to me that God has placed you as a member of Parliament for this very hour, kind of an Esther moment. And we need to encourage some of our young people, if you want to serve God, think about law. Think about going into politics.
Yeah.
We've got to get over this idea that politics is just a filthy vocation, that you can serve God there.
Yeah, you're so right. And I think that would extend to really, every major sphere, vocational sphere, the arts, medicine, etc.
The arts, medicine definitely. The arts, we need Christian artists. We need people to give us new visions of the, the fine arts, painting, sculpture, music, drama, and so on.
Yeah. Man,
thank you.
That's such a valuable, that's a compelling insight. I love it when we can say to people like, hey, you don't have to be, a worship songwriter or wanting to be a pastor or missionary to see your life as being incredibly important to the kingdom of God. So thank you for that insight. Yeah. Dr. Haykin, man, I feel like we've only scratched the surface of a lot of rich wisdom you have and insights we could learn from you. But want to just ask for those of us who are those who are going to be listening into this conversation, we would love for our listeners to get connected with you, to learn more about what you're doing, to learn about your work. And so what are some of the ways that they could get connected with you, or some of the online platforms they could engage with what you're doing?
Well, I have probably a couple. One is a podcast I'm doing on a weekly basis called Beat Podcast, which is sponsored by H&E Publishing out of Peterborough. So that's on a variety of podcast formats. And then the Andrew Fuller Center has a website, www.andrewfullercenter.org. It's based on the Jonathan Edwards, the Southern Seminary website. So those would be two. I'm happy to entertain emails. mhaykin at sbts.edu would be the major way to contact me. So
that's awesome.
Fantastic. Right on. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I know for me, it was just a really refreshing take in a day where people are so at each other, just to see some redeeming qualities from, even your past in feeling sort of pushed down and unloved in a new society, and really just finding a new life in Jesus that has opened up a world of compassion and care. That isn't hardened against the hurting, but desires to compassionately come alongside, that we're not at war, but we're there trying to transform the culture through Christ in our lives and the Spirit working within us. So I just want to say thank you so much for spending this time with us. And
thank you.
Thank you. We hope that we can do this again sometime.
Yep, love to. Yep, thank you.
Thank you.